This episode was recorded before we heard the sad news of James Earl Jones's passing. Rest in peace to a true legend.
Hello, welcome everybody to the latest episode of the GW Films Club. This is the podcast where I, Jordan Sorcery, and my good friend Rob.
Hello. Sorry, I missed my cue. Oh, God. Disaster.
We take a look at some films that have been cited by the creators of some of our favourite Games Workshop games and explore what kind of influences they may have had on the sort of development and the creation of a Warhammer, a 40k, an Age of Sigmar, whatever it might be. How have these films informed that? Now, sometimes we like to get a little bit loose with the rules. In this instance, we're going to get probably very loose with the rules. So we've got loads of citations, loads of references from many different people involved in the creation of Warhammer 40k and others about Conan and the Conan stories of Robert E. Howard. Now, there has been a film about Conan.
There's been a number of films.
There have been a number of films. There's one particularly iconic film, Conan the Barbarian, featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's the film that we're going to use as a sort of a launching point, but really we're going to get into all kinds of stuff as we explore this, and we'll talk about the stories and the books and how they evolved and changed, and how this feeds into a surprising number of different moments in time across Games Workshop history, I think. We'll start with one of the quotes we've got here, and this is actually from Brian Ansell, who co-founded Citadel and helped to grow Games Workshop into the sort of beginnings of what would become the miniature-focused company it is today. He said in an interview with the Realm of Chaos 80s blog that Khorne was derived from Conan's Crom, who is an actual Celtic god who can also be spelt Crom or Cram, using a K, and that he felt that was a good name for a war god. And I don't disagree.
Great name.
It's
absolutely great name. I think
name.
I will call my firstborn Crom.
But so what is... I mean, Rob, tell us, what's the sort of broad strokes of the Conan story? Conan the Barbarian as a film, Conan as a sort of book series, and what does how does he factor into it?
Sure, well, the film is the same as Mad Max. He has his family wiped out, takes revenge, does revenge, but Conan the Barbarian as a character is just this wonderful vehicle for Howard to write these stories of high adventure, high fantasy, high sorcery. He is a character that is a barbarian, as the film implies, a king, a reaver, a thief, a rogue, a scoundrel. He is everything. He's just this wonderful tool to explore the world of Hyperborea through. His creation in the 1930s by Howard, really one of those proto-sword and sorcery sort of creations. You had at the same time things like John Carter coming, all these weird tale things, Lovecraft, which we'll actually touch on in a bit, and all these very early fantasy tales, pre-Tolkien. It's what a lot of people forget, that things like John Carter and Conan predate Lord of the Rings by some time. And yet Tolkien say it became the dominant force, but these are ones that were then later rediscovered. You can tell almost by like Michael Moorcock, and were sort of established, and those books came back into the sort of stream of consciousness, and you could tell very much where the Games Workshop designers were and what they were reading when they were creating the Warhammer universe. Crom or Cram or Khorne is quite simply the god that Conan worships, which is really important because in both the Conan stories and in Warhammer, the deities and the gods are key to the mythology and the morality of the worlds. We talked about it briefly in the Hammer series about how often it's a battle between law and chaos, and the gods are just part of that. Yeah,
because I think there's perhaps more sort of interaction with gods in these worlds, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a very much a patron almost system where people will, and Conan will call upon Crom to give him strength, and Crom will answer as long as he fights and wins, which is very Khorne, but
100%.
But Khorne's Crom taken to the absolute level where it becomes addiction, and it's never enough. Whereas Crom seems a more moderate. He is the god of war.
Crom about like strength as well?
It's about martial prowess and strength and stuff. Yeah, it's just, really, it's not vague, but it's not as well defined as I would say the Chaos Gods. They don't have 2 hardback books. Yeah. It's really detailing them. And also it changes, and this is something we'll talk about later, but the relationship between Conan and the gods and the worlds changes a lot. It's mutable. It's not that fixed a canon.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and you talked about the sort of broad strokes of that Conan the Barbarian, the Arnie movie, where it is... We basically see Conan as a young boy, and we see this kind of village life. And it is kind of almost, if you were to take a Warhammer equivalent, it would be a Norscan village.
Yep.
Sort of a simple life, simple people who are sort of hunt and that's the kind of stuff they do. And then they get raided by essentially Chaos Warriors.
100%.
Thusela Doom is the actual leader of those Chaos Warriors in this case. Incredible name.
Second born.
Yeah.
Thusela Doom.
Which is, they turn up and there's some brutal sort of combat there. Killings. And that is when Conan is taken into slavery as a boy. And he's put on the Wheel of Pain, I think it's called, where he essentially is just, with a load of other slaves, is just pushing a wooden turnstile, essentially. And it seems to do it for a decade or more.
Yeah. Yeah, he goes from a small boy to Arnold Schwarzenegger.
yeah. And from there, he is then taken into the fighting pits, the gladiatorial arenas. He becomes incredibly successful at some point for some reason, and there's some really interesting ideas about why, but his slave owner just decides to free him. Yeah. And from there, he then goes on the sort of quest to get vengeance, essentially. And that's when he comes up against Thusela Doom. There's actually some interesting, you mentioned earlier about the sort of roguish elements. Yeah. He's not just a barbarian with a sword. No. He's infiltrating palaces and doing all kinds of stuff.
I mean, if you think of Conan, if you think of the average person in the street thinks of Conan, they'll probably say, leave me alone, why are you talking to me about a film from the 80s? But to the average fantasy fan, if you think of Conan, and most people probably think of him as a muscled guy in a loincloth swinging a sword around. Shout out to Les Edwards, we'll get back to that. However, he's not that. In the first book, the first proper Conan story, spoilers, he's actually already a king, which is what he manages to become really at the end of the film.
Yeah.
But he's described as having black hair that's cropped, he's wearing royal regal clothes and things, and throughout it, he's not always the barbarian we think of when we think of the naked man swinging his sword around. In fact, I think the film, and I think Gary Gygax said this as well, actually did it Conan a bit of a disservice. It makes him into a muscle-bound guy.
Sure.
And that's it. And actually, Conan, the character, is incredibly cunning, he's incredibly smart, he's incredibly charismatic. He feels very much not a self-insert, but he's an idealized character in many ways. Yeah, no, absolutely. And in the film, there's a lot of sneaking around. He gets his party together and they go sneaking. It's not all blood and guts and swords and stuff, actually. It is a lot of... It's very D&D.
It's really D&D. Yeah, they're basically an adventuring party. Yeah. There's an amazing giant snake. Some pretty cool... I thought they were pretty good special effects.
Great.
Yeah, some fun stuff there. But yes, they're fighting monsters. They're stealing jewels. It's almost like the cover of that Dungeons and Dragons book, where they're literally prying the jewels from the statue. But yeah, they're sort of interacting with lots of different things. There's cults, there's magic, where he goes to see a magician. And the films, the actual Conan the Barbarian film is drawing on loads of different inspirations. I think you're probably right. It does simplify Conan as a character. He's not an idiot by any means.
No.
Like, he's relatively smart, and he sort of knows what he needs to do in any given situation. But it definitely isn't... He's not, as I understand it, the very clever character from the books and the stories.
Yeah, I mean, William King said, I think, that he was reading Conan and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and they are much of a likeness. You've got the strong character of Fafhrd, and the Grey Mouser's a rogue, and Conan's almost like the pair of them put together. But there is that, they're not, he isn't just, and I keep saying it, an idiot swinging a sword around, which I do think the film emphasizes a bit too much.
Sure.
But that's personal opinion.
I think that's fair. I mean, you do get, from that interpretation of Conan, there's then some famous Games Workshop sort of re-implementations of that, where you get like Thrud by Carl Critchlow, which is a comic book strip in White Dwarf for many years. And that is basically that to an absurd degree. He's even more muscly than Arnie was, but he's got a tiny little sort of pickled onion head.
Well, he doesn't. He's got a normal sized head. It's just his muscles are so big.
That's the way. So it makes his head look very, very small on such a huge body.
Yeah.
And there's even in that, I mean, he's having sort of absurd adventures every week. He even turns up in things like Dark Future and Judge Dredd.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a character called Croneman the Simpleton.
Oh, I don't get it.
Which I believe may have been
a reference.
an even more referential character based on Conan.
Satire.
The reason that word has been chosen here is because it bears some similarity to the term Cimmerian, Conan the Cimmerian, right? Because that is where those are his people, and that's where he's from. So I assume that is, where obviously it's a very broad joke, but he's drawing on that.
I mean, shotgunning that joke.
Sure. Yeah. What of the Cimmerians, like, and their place within Hyboria and the sort of world?
Yeah, so interesting. So we need to clarify this. Is it Hyboria or Hyperborea?
Hyboria.
I always said Hyperborea. Why did you have to apologize sometimes when you're doing a podcast live, your brain just dissipates. Hyborian. Yeah, you're right. Madness. Yeah. I think I said Hyperborea earlier.
Right.
Keep this in. I need to learn. So this is the whole interesting thing that basically got the Cimmerians, who are real people. They were on the sort of north of the Black Sea, Caucasus Mountains, and in reality were people who sort of bordered with the Scythians and sort of eventually it's theorized amalgamated with the Scythians and became one of the many peoples of Eastern Asia who would later come to prominence when those sorts of people of the East moved through the West via the Vandals and the Alans and the Huns, etc. But in terms of Hyboria, the Cimmerians are quite an interesting one because they're quite they remind me of, and I'm gonna bring out an idea here which might disgust people. The very Age of Sigmar, the very Dark Oath in Age of Sigmar. They are people who are living at the edge of magic. They are not fully invested. They're not all gribbly people with tentacles and called Falasdoom and worship snakes and stuff. Well, they do, but they worship things, but they don't. They're still humans, and they still sort of have that. There is magic in their world. There's soothsaying. There's witches. But they're not that full converted to chaos. There's always that idea of how would chaos survive? It doesn't make any sense. Well, the Dark Oath and the Norse are a great example of how that would actually work. Again, it wouldn't work and it makes no sense because we're talking about Warhammer. But they are people that live at the edge of chaos. And that's kind of the Cimmerians as well. Crom is real and Crom will help. And Conan can fight these battles against ridiculous odds to stay alive when he should be killed so many times over because he's literally being empowered by a god. But they're not full. He is not a champion of Crom in that he wears Crom armor and wields a Crom axe and he's got, a Crom shield, if that makes sense. So I think they're a really good archetype for the forces at the fringes of chaos in both fantasy battle and Age of Sigmar.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, and what's, the Dark Oath, I think, share a sort of certain amount of DNA with the Norse of the earlier Warhammer fantasy sort of setting, and then what later became the sort of Kurgans and the Kull and those guys, because obviously in later Warhammer it kind of became the idea that almost all of the Northmen had pledged themselves to chaos, mostly because of how they lived. It just lent itself to being a chaos worshipper. They might not have actually cared. They might have been worshipping a different god altogether who happened to be an aspect of
that's
one
exactly
of
the same as the Dark Oath. They will worship their local deity.
Right.
It's just that deity may have to be a sliver of each.
Sure.
They worship the 8-legged spider. Cool. But the 8-legged spider actually is Zeech.
Right.
But they don't know that. They never heard the word Zeech.
Sure. And it's not even that they're not even out for chaos to win. They're just staying alive, and their society is sort of propagating and doing whatever it does.
Yeah, very much.
So I think that's really interesting. I mean, actually, you mentioned a couple of the inspirations for Howard and how he was drawing on real history.
Yeah,
and he placed Hyboria, the Hyborian age, into history.
Yes,
right. He sort of said, "Here's a period of legend that may have happened on Earth."
Yes,
and we don't really know how we got from before to after.
Yeah.
But that gives me enough wiggle room to tell these, weird and wonderful stories.
I mean, his before does include the fall of Atlantis. So
of course.
It really is.
Which definitely happened.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes, I forgot that happened.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's 10,000 years into the past or something like that.
It's pre-Ice Age.
Sure.
It's all, yeah. It's very clever. It's a really good
It's a great idea,
device.
yeah. And just as a quick tangent, John Milius, who directed and wrote Conan the Barbarian, the movie, so he was brought in after Oliver Stone, the famous filmmaker, had written the original script, which is very surprising.
Yeah, right.
But Oliver Stone, decided that 10,000 years in the past was no good. He wanted to put it into some sort of 10,000 years into the future, post-apocalyptic setting, which would have been functionally the same.
Yes.
It just would have been the future, not the past.
I was not aware of that.
Yeah, really, really interesting, odd choice.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's got any kind of 40K sort of ideas.
So can we blend it into Fury Road?
I mean, I guess you would go into, that might be a sort of prospective sort of Conan in the future kind of thing. Obviously, the movie then was reset. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to put it in the past.
Yeah.
But your point before, just about how history was a real sort of part of Howard's creation of Conan, that's something that Rick Priestley has also mentioned.
Yeah.
So he said that Robert E. Howard's archetypal barbarian, mighty thewed, loincloth and sandals, the prototype between many a role-playing character class, especially influential is Howard's approach to fantasy world building based on historical types. Hyboria blends nations and peoples from the dawn of history to later medieval Europe, recasting them in a fantasy mold, much as I would do with the Warhammer world.
Yeah.
Which I think is super interesting. It's almost like obviously influenced by what Howard had done, but almost a parallel kind of process of taking loads of real world historical knowledge that both had and then sort of tweaking and changing it, drawing inspiration from sort of saying, okay, I really like the uniforms and the social structures of that era of history in that part of Europe.
Yeah.
Let's grab that, but let's also take this other thing. Let's also take this other thing. Let's also take this other
Let's have the Holy Roman Empire next to medieval France.
Exactly, right? And that's how you give rise to what the Warhammer world was. Which also, you mentioned before how Tolkien came after.
Yes.
But Warhammer took both, right?
Yeah.
It took Howard's Barbarians and Norska and put the Hyborian Age on the map right next to Tolkien's Middle-earth.
Yep. And then threw some more gods in as well.
Sure.
So yeah, it really is. They're the three pillars of Warhammer are probably more Tolkien and Howard. I would be surprised if I'm trying to think of another one to add there, but those three are the big three.
It feels like, and I'm sure there's more, and I'm sure in a future episode we'll come back and add more to that list. And
I've got a pop quiz for you very quickly.
Okay,
where's Conan from?
Is it pronounced Cimarron?
Well, in the first story, he's from Ireland.
Is he?
So in the first ever story, People of the Dark, Conan is revealed to be a past life of an Englishman who falls down in a cave and bops his head and remembers that actually he was once Conan, a reaver from Ireland who was raiding Britain.
Right.
And then by the next story, all of that is completely written out.
Right.
And I think that, to go back to Mad Max, we were talking about last time, is another influence on Warhammer, that it's mutable and changeable and the canon can change and it's fine. And I do think that's another lesson from Howard there, that actually you can tell great stories and you can change it, it's fine.
Sure, and I think that I'm right in saying that across all of the different short stories, much like you would see with Sherlock Holmes, there's a lot of stuff in the canon that doesn't actually make sense alongside other stuff. Right?
And there's a lot of stretching. Do you know who he reminds me of the most in terms of a literary creation for Warhammer? Gotrek.
Okay.
Off of Gotrek and Felix, because you've got the stories in the Warhammer world and now he's in the Mortal Realms.
Yeah.
And it is that kind of, he's not an idiot. He's a guy with a big axe. But again, I think Gotrek and Conan have a lot of similarities, actually. You've got the Fafhrd and Grey Mouse thing of Felix and Gotrek. But then he almost morphs more into a Conan. And then in the Age of Sigmar stories, he gets his own little party, his own Red Sonja, his own, little group. So I'd say that Gotrek's quite a Conan light. Well, light's not fair. A Conan-esque character in terms of literary storytelling within Warhammer.
Yeah, that's fascinating, actually. I mean, especially given that King, as you said, was drawing on some of those influences and sort of saw and enjoyed some of that stuff. Yeah. I think that we see the barbarian, and we sort of, touching on that kind of Norscan idea, or the Northers, or the Dark Oath, the Savages. That, obviously, there's plenty of that across lots of Warhammer fiction. I mean, I've just been reading The Riders of the Dead by Dan Abnett, and that definitely brings to life the kind of barbarians and how they might work and how they would worship their version of the Chaos Gods and how these marauders might actually work as a society.
Yeah.
You know, because they are, you know, they're barbarians, they're savages, but they still have some sort of social structure.
Yeah, and actually I just finished Brand, which is a Dark Oath novel, which similar sort of thing. You know, it's about a power struggle between different tribes, and there is almost the scene from the film where he goes and talks to the soothsayer. You know, that's almost in there. Yeah, I think it's an incredibly strong archetype. I think Conan is a wonderful creation. I think Howard is really... I think he's one of the forgotten writers, genuinely, despite the success of things like Conan. I don't think many people could name him, whether that was just to do with the fact it was the 30s and people forget there was fantasy literature before Tolkien. But, you know, you do hear people say, oh, Warhammer's just Lord of the Rings, you know, like it's just a rip-off of Lord of the Rings. I think you could remove Tolkien from Warhammer, but you might not be able to remove Howard or Moorcock or someone like that. I think they're more ingrained than the Wood Elves and the Goblins. You know, like what's more important is chaos, and chaos is covered better by Howard and Moorcock. I keep referencing Moorcock. I just, whenever I'm reading Howard and watch Conan, I think this is like a Moorcock book.
Yeah, it's a real shame that there's no Moorcock movies really, or good ones that really capture the Eternal Champion.
Just like what, a Jerry Cornelius film,
right? But there's no.
And I think that's it.
And it's just not been tapped.
No. I believe the Rune staff is coming soon. The Hawk Moon books.
Right. Okay. Which obviously incredibly influential. So
yeah, absolutely.
If such a movie does come out, then we can immediately do an episode about 40k and Warhammer Fantasy and how it borrows so much.
I think there's politics in it though.
Right. But yeah, I think just going back to your Dark Oath Savages. I mean, one of the things that I loved in the
stop calling them savages.
Are they not called Dark Oath Savages?
I don't know. They might be.
I thought that was the official name.
That may be the copyrightable name is Dark Oath Savages. It's a very good chance.
At least was originally. Yeah, I mean, when they first turned up in Silver Tower, right? The Dark Oath
Chief
Slaughter Priest, was he?
No, Dark Oath Chieftain. Slaughter Priest's a blade of corn, dude.
You're quite right.
Yeah.
You're quite right. So the Dark Oath Chieftain who is trapped in the Silver Tower.
Yes.
I mean, he in the Silver Tower book by Andy Clark is quite an interesting character, actually. And there's a kind of fascinating story with him about how he wants to escape.
Yeah.
And he wants to do so because he wants the power in order to save his village and his people.
Yeah.
And you kind of go on this journey with him, and ultimately then he gets to choose whether or not he will take the Gaunt Summoner's offerings so that he will be powerful enough to save his village. And you know, I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but sometimes these things have a sudden twist in the tail when you accept a gift from the Chaos Gods.
No.
Yeah, they do.
Straight up lads, then.
They don't always offer exactly what they mean.
No. But what a miniature as well.
Great miniature.
Just to talk about, that is one of the few miniatures. I remember John Blanche painting it, didn't convert it, which is an incredible honour.
I mean, it looks like the John Blanche concept art, I think.
It's spot on. Just the smirk on his face that he's just about to take your head. Like, I hope you enjoyed your head because you're not going to have it for much longer.
And then Warcry really leans into the Conan of it all, I think. I mean, you get Red Harvest, which has a particular character who we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah.
In the Dark Oath Warband.
Yeah.
Who looks, you know, he's
the Les Edward.
It's a perfect Hero Quest barbarian, which itself, you know, obviously has Conan relationship.
Yes.
But even the sort of witch priestess who is a member of the squad looks like she's from a Conan story and from a Conan.
She's the crone.
Right.
She's the soothsayer, the crone. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Warcry as a game is a Howard adventure written out. You've got these weird and wonderful, and almost I think the film. Obviously, we've left the film long behind, but one of the main parts of the film is the snake cult that Conan has to infiltrate in order to rescue the daughter of a local, like, powerful lord or something.
Yeah, he's a king who's been overpowered. He's still officially king, but the cult of Set have kind of really got the power behind the scenes now, and Thuzula Doom is kind of controlling him. Yeah,
and so he has to infiltrate this snake cult, and there's a warband within Warcry, the Splintered Fang, who are just snake dudes.
Yeah.
And they look like they've stepped out of the pages.
They do.
They are wonderful. There's so much in Warcry. If you just want to play some Conan adventure, if you some Hyborian adventures, play Warcry.
Yeah, you easily could. I mean, God. Jade Obelisk were the other ones that look to me like the guards from the Set Palace.
100% Spire Tyrants are just a load of gladiator lads, as we say, with the fighting pits and stuff. You could reskin Warcry to Hyboria.
Yeah.
Without changing a thing.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like, you've got spider cultists, you've got snake cultists, you've got, I think there's a lot of, Conan in Age of Sigmar, because I think Age of Sigmar is highly influenced by those writers from the 30s. It is more pulp. It is wackier in a way than Tolkien and the sort of the more grounded fantasy that came after. Age of Sigmar to me feels like a 30s serial. It's way more that, but that comes from Howard. That comes from Lovecraft. It comes from Elder Gods and stuff like that. The first Conan story actually is arguably a Lovecraft mythos story.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because there was a lot of overlap between Lovecraft and Howard, right? They borrowed names and stuff.
Borrowed names, yeah. Howard wrote 3 stories. The Skull Face is one of them. The Gates of an Unpronounceable Word is another one. You know, like they wrote about 3 unofficial. You know, all the sort of second wave that came with August Derleth writing. And
sure. Yes.
He wrote some mythos. I remember you got told off on a comment. I can't remember how you meant to say
mythos is the real pronunciation. Yeah.
The mythos of Mygo. They very much overlapped, and those sort of that blending of fantasy with star gods is very Warhammer.
Yeah.
That's very, that isn't Tolkien, and I'm not ragging on Tolkien. I bloody love Lord of the Rings, but it's a different fantasy. Very much perpetuated by Howard. And not even these Conan books. There's a wonderful one, which is called, and oh my God, I hate doing a podcast, Valley of the Worm, I believe it's called. And that is literally that could be a story put into the old world or Age of Sigmar of, here's a champion of chaos out to prove himself.
Right.
Read that, it's great. It's not free online. Best thing about Howard is, best thing about Howard's writing is creativity, but now it's all out of copyright, so it's all online, short stories. You've got no excuse not to read a Howard novel. I'd say novelette. They take an evening to read, and they're well worth your time if you are into Warhammer, particularly Barbarians.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned there, just talking about Warcry and how you could reskin it to be a Hyborian game.
Yeah.
I mean, there's another sort of bit of parallel or kind of influential DNA for Warhammer that Rick Priestley is also referred to, and that's the Hyborian war game that Tony Berth created, right? Because he'd worked with Donald Featherstone on some of the early historical games that were super influential.
Yeah, very much. So, yes, basically, they were 2 of the big names, with Lionel Tarr, I would say, as well, in the... I'm going to sound such a hipster here. I call it second wave of wargaming, because the initial wave is stuff like Kriegspiel from the Prussian army, H.G. Wells firing his cannons on the floor. Then we'd have 2 dirty Great World Wars. Everyone goes off war for a little bit, goes, that had a lot of that now. And then in the 60s, this new wave started, spearheaded by Tony Bath, Donald Featherstone, Lionel Tarr, Charles Grant, loads of names. But Bath wrote an Ancients rule set. And, this is when the models that you can use are either the very primitive Airfix originals or German flat miniatures. All of his miniatures were flats, which I don't know if you've ever seen a flat miniature.
I've not.
Almost 2D. I will show you some. I've got some Prussian guards somewhere. But basically, imagine a 32mm model squished.
So like a advent calendar chocolate.
Almost like an advent calendar chocolate in miniature form. And his armies were all these German flat models. And he wrote rules. But rather than write rules for Romans and Parthians and Gauls, he just decided to do Hyboria. Because guess what? Do what you want then. If you collect Romans... You can't really collect pikemen. The Romans didn't use pike, but, you've got a lot of Romans, but also you want some pikemen. Well, no one says the Sumerians don't use pikemen, so and the rules are the bread and butter of probably modern wargaming, rolling to hit, saving throws, things like that, which now sound, surely every game you roll to hit and every game you roll to save. No, absolutely not. In historicals, absolutely not. And that is what Warhammer became. I think Featherstone came up with the 6-inch movement rate.
Right.
I think a man in a Featherstone game moved 6 inches, 12 inches at a rush.
Yeah.
It's these little things that just became the bread, which is 40k ever since 1998, But yeah, the Bath Hyboria is definitely an influence. There's no way it's not.
Yeah. Because these were literally the games that Rick Priestley, Richard Halliwell, Tony Epworth, and others were playing in the sort of Lincoln War Games club after school.
Yeah, because that's all there was.
Yeah.
You went and go, oh my God, I just sounded so old. But that was all it was. Price of cheese were cheaper as well. Yeah, you went and got the book from the library because they carried wargame books in libraries. And yeah, you played out these games. And what it meant was, because you are severely limited with miniatures, it meant you could pick up your Mongols and go, great, I can play this against my friends Romans. Do that nowadays, I would laugh at you. Most people wouldn't care. I, however, I'm a big nerd and would laugh at you. But it was that excuse of I'm just going to paint a load of swordsmen and a load of, and it's really important not to underestimate how important how it is, because the other branch of Warhammer that isn't historical gaming is fantasy gaming. What is the world's biggest fantasy game? Dungeons and Dragons. And what was Gygax and Arneson recreating with their fantasy games? They were recreating Howard's stories. They were bits of Tolkien, bit of that, but it's Conan through and through. Barbarian becomes one of the major classes.
Sure.
Within 2 supplements of D&D kind of thing. It's immediately like, what are we going to do? We're going to infiltrate a cult, and I'll be a barbarian, you be a rogue, you be a wizard. That's D&D.
Yeah.
Straight away. Which brings us nicely, I think, to Warhammer Quest and Hero Quest.
Yes, I think so. And there is, we talked about it a little bit before, and there's that sort of connection to whether or not the film oversimplified the character of Conan. But it definitely captured the visual sort of character, the representation of Conan, if nothing else. Arnie is physically perfect for that role. And some of the visuals, I think, really do evoke the kind of Howard world and the sort of the Conan look and feel. And the reason for that is because they were modeling themselves on a lot of Frazetta art. The Frank Frazetta covers that are incredible pieces of art that are iconic and are just amazing. And then they themselves were influencing the artist who did the UK releases, the covers for the UK updated releases of Conan. And that was Les Edwards.
Yes.
So he was trying to sort of capture that Frank Frazetta feel. So he had actually, for many editions of a sort of whole run of Conan stories, he was doing the UK covers. And then at some point, he ended up moving on. I mean, he's got a quote where he just said that he wasn't terribly disappointed to give up Conan after all that time. So it was only with a little regret that Conan and him parted company, at least for a while, but that he's still asked, and this was in the 80s, in Blood and Iron, the art book, he said he was still asked to paint the occasional barbarian, however, not least Hero Quest. And that's because he also did the cover to Hero Quest, the absolutely classic, the iconic cover to the MB Games Workshop game, which, I think is in the running for one of the best pieces of box art.
I think it might be the best box cover for a board game ever.
It's definitely in that.
Perfect.
It's in the top echelons for sure. Because it captures the dynamism and the excitement, the immersion, the fantasy of all of it.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is the barbarian character who's front and center, swinging his sword, having a whale of a time.
Oh my God. You wanted to play that guy.
Yeah.
You looked at that. Actually, the coolest ones were in the back. But the one at the front, swinging his sword, absolutely amazing. It's just spot on. Everything about that cover I think is perfect because it's nice and dark. It's not too busy, which I think a lot of covers can suffer from, where they're trying to cram everything onto the front of the box.
Yeah.
It's just perfect, and it is Conan. Like, I think he looks a bit more like Sly Stallone. I'm trying to think.
He's probably a bit leaner, I think.
He's not as like full
top heavy.
Yeah, he's more realistic in a way.
Sure.
He's almost like a gladiator from the TV show. Like he looks like an actual fitness guy. But it's just brilliant.
Yeah,
absolutely
it's great.
brilliant. I would love to know if that was a real model. If that was someone.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd love to know.
I don't know.
If you're in the comments, if you're watching YouTube,
Les Edwards.
No. Les Edwards, or the model. If you happen to be the model for the Barbarian Hero Quest, let us know. And if not, if you've modelled for any other box covers, let us know in the comments, please.
Yeah.
Al Pacino, if you're in the in the audience for Horus Heresy.
Sure.
You seen the Pacino Marine?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Pacino Marine's amazing.
He's fantastic. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah,
I mean,
my little bolter.
That's going to open the door for all the Al Pacino movies for future episodes.
Meet the fuckers.
But I think, is he in Meet the Fuckers?
Oh, that's Robert De Niro.
That's Robert De Niro.
That's me being Italian-American racist.
Oh no,
Oh no.
but yeah, on the Les Edwards piece, actually, interestingly, one of his Conan covers actually graced the cover of White Dwarf as well.
Ooh.
Yeah, so I think it was Conan the Rebel, and it was White Dwarf 107.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great piece. It's
Yeah.
really, really fun, but I think it was one of his later ones.
Do you think the film solidified Conan the Barbarian as Conan the Barbarian? Do you think he'd just been known as Conan if it wasn't for the film?
Yeah, I think probably, because it was a very successful movie,
Yeah.
and I think it had a big impact on popular sort of knowledge. Like you said before, most people probably couldn't tell you who wrote Conan, or I think who directed that movie.
No, I couldn't.
But I think it is, as an sort of the iconography of that
Yeah.
movie and the beginning of Arnie's career, sort of lodged it in popular consciousness as this is what this guy, Conan is a barbarian.
Yeah. I think, again, and I don't know how I'm getting this into every episode, but it does tap into that sort of WWF zeitgeist
It
as
does.
well of the 80s of the
It does.
muscly
I mean,
oily
there
man.
are in Conan the Barbarian, the movie, there's a couple of wrestlers in it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know there are literally the characters, the barbarian and the warlord, who are wrestlers, like who are just, meant to be Conan, basically.
Yeah, I think Thuzel Doom's two sort of his chief soldiers, his henchmen, they're both wrestlers, I believe.
Right.
And one of them even uses a warhammer at one point, which is fun.
Can we just give a shout out to James Earl Jones, by the way?
Oh, amazing.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Brilliant. We need him. Come on, Games Workshop. Make a character of Thuzel Doom. Call him something else.
Yeah.
But my God.
Fantastic.
He's so threatening.
Yeah, he's really, really good.
Not. Well, he is, but he's a perfect cult leader.
He's fantastic. And because there's also the sort of suggestion, it's not fully explained, I don't think, but in the movie there's a suggestion that he's using mind control.
Yeah,
he's kind of got the sort of snake, like hypnotic vision.
Yeah.
And he uses that early on to stop Conan's mother from attacking him. And then he kills her.
Yeah.
And then he's using it right at the very end to try and stop Conan from attacking him. But obviously Conan, being a great warrior and out for vengeance and whatever it is, breaks through the control. But the act and the acting from James Earl Jones of using that hypnotic power is so good.
Just perfect. He's absolutely spot. He's a great chaos character.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, great chaos lord.
And you mentioned it very early on, but we should go back to the imagery of the raiders at the beginning of the film.
Yes.
Oh my God, that just chaos. It took a long time for Games Workshop to do anything as good as them for Chaos Knights. There's a wonderful Chaos Lord miniature, which I imagine will get done with Old World, where the horses stood still, which is kind of, I think that's based on a Frazetta piece.
Right, yes, Death Dealer, I think.
It's not riding into combat, and that's kind of how you see Thuzel Doom to begin with. He's just on his horse. And that, they just nail it. That moment of them coming out of the forest, that's the beginning of the storm of chaos, isn't it, for most people? It's like, I've been living this life the whole time. Oh no, who are these? Yeah. Oh no, I'm dead.
And that's part of why, for me, the Storm of Chaos is a really interesting narrative, because it does scale up, and you do start from literally just odd omens and that sort of thing, and then the Northers start coming out. Yeah, barbarians coming through the forests, and they're basically coming to end the Empire and destroy it. I think it leads to some really interesting narratives and some interesting stories. Scales up in a really fascinating way.
Yeah, it's very much that's the central story of the Old World, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's the culmination of that story, and it really brings it to that sort of final place. But obviously, that takes it in a very different direction from Conan. But the fact that the Northmen and the sort of the Kull, the Kurgan, these Conan-esque barbarians, because they're smart as well, and they've got they're not just mindless killers; they are quite purposeful in what they're doing. Yeah, they are a central force within the fall or the end times, I suppose. So it's quite interesting, I think. And they are, it's exactly that scene from Conan the Barbarian. And I mentioned as well early on just about the slave owner, and he lets Conan go. And I just want to give a shout out to David Hines on Twitter, who put out an amazing thread. I'll put it in the show notes down below, where he just goes into great detail exploring the potential motivations for why Red Hair, I think he calls him, the slave owner, his decision to release Conan, because it comes after a scene where they're having an audience with the Khan, and the Khan asks he basically said he's disappointed that his sons don't understand him. Yeah. And then he asks one of his sons what's good in life. And the son talks about riding and the wind through his hair and a falcon at his wrist. And then that disappoints the Khan. And then he asks Conan. And then Conan obviously gives the very famous quote.
Yeah.
To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of their women. And I think that the sort of thread explores that and how that answer and how it wins approval from the Khan and how that changes the status of Conan and the slave owner. So it's a fascinating sort of thread. I think it's well worth a look. But yeah, I mean, I've taken us a ways away from the sort of Les Edwards and the Conan-inspired cover for Hero Quest.
And we see the impact of that because then every dungeon game that Games Workshop created for a long time afterwards copied that. You look at Advanced Hero Quest, which is not great as a cover. It's very much someone attempting a Les Edwards cover, not to a great amount of success. It looks a bit silly, looks a bit Poundland knockoff.
Maybe more cartoony.
Yeah. Then Warhammer Quest coming in the 90s, and front and centre, Barbarian stood there. Great cover. Not as good as the Les Edwards one.
Well, I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying. I think for me, there's a nostalgia factor to the Warhammer Quest cover. Absolutely adore it. It was kind of the beginning of my real Warhammer sort of obsession and the hobby for me.
Yeah. The bit bright for me.
It's very bright. It's obviously it's posed in a very different way. Mm-hmm. And I think the Barbarian, though, tells an interesting story there because he does go from the sort of really stripped down Arnie Conan the Barbarian to he looks almost like Conan the King at the end of the Barbarian movie.
Like, what are you doing in this down here?
Because he's got the furs, he's got the jewels, all that sort of stuff, right?
What are you doing, mate? You look like a warlord.
Yeah, why are you going back in?
Just go out. Send one of your men, yeah. No, absolutely does. Very different. And the Silver Tower, then the quest redo by Age of Sigmar, and you've got a Dark Oath, who we've mentioned earlier. It's front and centre. Yeah. It's so iconic, and it is from Conan. It's simply from Conan. There aren't barbarians in the Fellowship of the Ring. Barbarians really, and it is all the character of Conan, created by Howard, and then in a way immortalised by the film. Yeah. Because when you think of Conan, that's what you think of.
Yeah, hugely.
Simple as that.
Yeah. One thing I just wanted to add in was when you mentioned the Advanced Hero Quest cover, almost having a bit of a knockoff feel.
Yeah.
Which, it's perfectly good. It does its job. Mm-hmm. It's almost interesting in that it's Advanced Hero Quest. You would have thought it would have been less cartoony. Yeah. But it's probably more cartoony.
Yes, it's very... Yes, it really is.
It does go in that direction.
It's very odd. It's a very caricatured depiction.
Yeah. But I think it's worth just mentioning for fans of James Hewitt, so the designer of Warhammer Quest Silver Tower, who resurrected Warhammer Quest, brought it back. He's a huge fan of those like proper knockoffs. Yeah. So the kind of pound store versions of these games that you would find, and he's done plenty of tweeting over the years about some of his favorites. One is Hero Cults,
looks so
which
good.
it's it is the perfect kind of like someone's drawn that in an afternoon and they were given the reference image and they were trying to recreate it.
Fantastic.
So I will include a link to that.
Please do. A whole history of it. How did Hero Cults come to be?
One of the things I really love in the movie is Mako, who plays the wizard. Yeah. He's so great. His voice is amazing. As an actor, he's just really, really good. Yeah. And they actually, I mean, famously, the sort of magic that's performed in order to heal Conan after he's injured, he sort of paints on a load of glyphs and sigils and sort of runes onto his skin. It's an amazing moment.
Very Lorgar to jump into Warhammer 40,000 there for a moment.
Right, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because that's not from Conan at all. No. So that's taken from Kwaidan, which is a Japanese horror film. And itself a film inspired by horror short stories and like Japanese folklore. Yeah. But in that story, there's a musician who's being plagued by ghosts who want them to... the ghosts want him to play for them. Right. And he goes to a priest, and then the priest's like, I can protect you, and I use these sigils, and I'll paint them on your body. Yeah. They paint all over his body, but they don't cover his ears. So when the ghost comes back to see him, the ghost can only see his ears because they're not protected. So the ghost rips his ears off and takes them away. No. And so it's sort of, I don't know what the moral of the story is, but it's like a really it's a very striking visual, and it's employed to great effect in the Conan movie. Yeah, if you're going to plagiarize something cool and make it cool.
Is that the second film where Arnie covers himself in something to be invisible to an enemy?
Interesting.
Maybe we need to do a whole genre of Arnie covering himself in stuff to be invisible to an enemy films.
Well, I mean, we see it in Predator, right?
That's it.
Yeah. So I think in the sense that you see it through the Quest series, like the influence coming from Conan the Barbarian and being very, very close to that, and then sort of evolving and changing, but retaining the Barbarian, retaining the kind of Conan archetype all the way up to Age of Sigmar, where we are today. With the Dark Codes, and they were a major release at the end of third edition. They remain really super important. Warcry, as we've sort of touched on. Yeah, it's fascinating to me how integral Conan and the sort of Howard sort of world, the Hyborian kind of age, and his version of fantasy. Yeah. It underpins so much, but it isn't talked about nearly as much as the other stuff, the Lord of the Rings and everything else.
Yeah. Tolkien is overly credited in Warhammer, I would say.
Yeah, I mean,
it's incredible.
I think,
as mentioned earlier.
Obviously we'll do an episode. Yeah. I've no doubt we'll get into Lord of the Rings and the Tolkien.
They made a film of that.
They have made a film about it.
Yeah, it's a prequel trilogy as well.
Pretty good. I don't.
Can we not cover them? I don't want to cover them. Please don't make me watch them.
But I think it's quite clear that there is a huge influence from Conan, from the stories, and to an extent from the Arnie movies, the John Milius movie, Conan the Barbarian. So I think this has been a really interesting conversation and exploration of that. One thing I just wanted to mention, just because I think it's important to cover this kind of thing, is unfortunately Conan the Barbarian, the movie, has been heavily criticized for tripping horses and for being inhumane.
Really?
Yeah, it has. I mean, the American Humane Organization lists it as its lowest rating. Wow. It's been proven that they did trip horses. I mean, there's stuff where a horse gets knocked over and rolls down a hillside, and there's stakes in the ground.
Oh, jeez.
I don't know if any were injured or any died. Those kind of scenes, they really go through me. I think it's a real shame. Just because I can't not see
the... ruined it for me.
Yeah,
I was not aware.
Well, sorry, I apologize, but I thought it was worth just calling out because I don't... as much as there's greatness in the film, it's not a perfect movie, but it's a fun movie and there's some really iconic, important stuff in it. Yeah. I think it's also worth holding those pieces of art to account for when they do things wrong. Yeah. And thankfully we've moved past that for the most part in sort of Hollywood and making films. It still happens, but I think I don't want to just not mention it.
I was not aware of that.
I think that there's probably even more to cover.
So much
about this, and you never know. We might come back. We might get into Conan the Destroyer specifically.
I need to watch it first.
We might do. We might cover a later Conan movie. But for now. I think it was Jason Momoa.
Jason Momoa. Yeah. Yes, it is, yes.
But for now, I think we can draw a line under our Conan conversation. We're going to be recording another episode of the show. We're enjoying doing this, and we'd love to hear from people about what films they would like us to cover. If you've got quotes and citations and sort of conversations from actual Games Workshop designers, writers, artists talking about films that inspired them and inspired their work in Games Workshop, then that's great. Let us know, because that really helps, and that might identify some stuff we could talk about, because there's loads of films that we know or feel have inspired it, but we want that kind of real connection. But we've got a couple more ideas coming up. I mean, Rob, do you want to give people a clue of what we might be covering next?
Well, next week, what we're watching, We Won't Need Eyes. Crom!
As ever, either that or it will be James Cameron's Aliens, which I'm looking forward to a great deal. So join us for that one next time.